Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 498 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum Podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's January the 24th, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Bob Pearson. I'm president of W2O Group, and I spend my days focused on digital marketing and communications.
And I mean, you've got a crazy, interesting, fascinating history. You've written books. You write a lot. So I'm sort of not even sure where to start with you a little bit, Bob. But let's start with tell me a bit about the agency right now, what you're doing, where you guys are at. I've known Aaron Strout for a long time, but for those who may not be familiar with the shop, what are you guys about?
Yeah, so what we do is we actually think about what we call pragmatic disruption of the status quo. So we're a consulting firm, but the foundation of our firm is we actually build our own algorithms and software, and we're figuring out how do you actually do media relations better or issues management better or search better. And really what we're doing is taking big data, applying it to algorithms that we create ourselves, and then from there the precision that you get and the insights you get actually allow us to be far more strategic in what we provide to our clients. So it's basically an effective use of data to change how we market.
Is the roots of the shop PR communications?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the great parts of our heritage, because in PR, what are we ultimately good at? We're good at telling stories. We're good at figuring out what the messaging should be. It's like being great in advertising as a start. And so those same roots really apply very nicely when you can actually have data to support or, quite frankly, tell you you're off base and what you think the story should be.
Okay, so let's cycle back, because I don't want to say you used a lot of buzzwords, but I do like to tell people that you can't throw a marketer down a flight of stairs without the words big data tumbling out of their pockets. So let's work a little bit back. What do you mean by what is this big data, and what are you talking about when you talk about self-created algorithms? Because that's like my eyes sort of spun around a little bit. I was like, what does that mean?
I'm smiling as you say it. What we do is we actually look at what do human beings do, and human beings make the world actually quite small. So they always follow patterns, and they follow the herd. So in other words, if you think of any brand, people can't think of more than 200 to 400 questions about a brand. If you think of an issue, they can't think of more than 77 questions that they ask over and over again. If you look at who drives share of conversation in the market, there's not more than 50 people who will drive the majority of share of conversation. So because they make the world small, you can then figure out what do you actually track, and from there you can figure out how to get to the right insights. So that's an example of the way we look at it.
So now can you tell me a story? Tell me a story, Bob, about a client or a piece of work that you've seen that you think is a sort of a simplification of it. Like, I'm a 7-year-old, about how that has been applied and worked for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think of two quick examples. One is Red Bull is a client of ours, and they're an amazing company and they get a tremendous amount of coverage. But how do you actually know if that is the right coverage? And so what we do is we actually can figure out how to actually filter through what actually happens online, so you can see that a skateboarder in Chicago is actually productive for them related to X topic. And that is a taxonomy-based software approach that we built that didn't exist before. Because there's so much noise out there, you have to know what's meaningful. Or something more simple like the Mayo Clinic. We've looked at what do the Mayo Clinic's providers actually do online versus what is said about Mayo Clinic versus what is said about health overall. So then you can start to see what are people absorbing online, and what are they sharing online, and what do they care about. So at the root of this is what we call audience architecture. How do you actually understand what your audience really cares about, and then how do you align with them? It's kind of the opposite of what advertising has done for years, which is always put together great campaigns and told people about it. Here we're saying, let's figure out what the audience is actually doing, listen to them, and then align with them.
So what does Red Bull, and it doesn't have to be the sort of like the result of, but what does someone like Red Bull then do with that information? Are we seeing products in market that are different than what they were thinking? Are we seeing a different way in which they place media? I'm trying to understand what they do with that output.
Yeah, so really, when you think about it, if you're trying to judge if something is successful or not, what we've looked at in the past is how many impressions we got or how many website visits or things like that. And those actually don't tell you a whole lot. So what you really want to do is to say, if you care about a skateboarding event in a city, did the people in your audience who matter for that brand, what did they do? Did they talk about it? Did they retweet? Did they share comments? Did they create their own content related to it? Or did they do nothing? And, this is not about Red Bull, but in general, what you see with some types of campaigns that occur is that they may get really high awareness, but then no one actually does anything. They're not searching, they're not recommending, they're not sharing. So the campaign itself may not be working. But that's what we're really judging is are people actually doing something different and moving towards whatever the goal is for that particular brand.
So let's fast forward a little bit and talk about where we presently find ourselves, because this is sort of the world in which I think people like you and I who've been doing this a lot longer than most people had hopes that you would sort of do this based off of all of the stuff you just said and more. And I feel like we've actually hit a very different point in time where Facebook is this 800-pound gorilla, as is YouTube, as are a couple of other channels. What is it? 80% of time spent on mobile is on 3 or 4 apps, and YouTube and Facebook are obviously in there, Twitter as well, I'm sure. And that the game feels to me like it's actually become very traditional and it's become this sort of GRP impression-based world. I'm not happy with that. I know the way you think, you're not happy with that either, but that creates a lot of challenges for people like you and I in this business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think that that's the way to go either. There's a very simple model that, the 1990 model, and that's one of the things we go by. So in any marketplace anywhere in the world, less than 1% of a market creates content, about 9% shares content, and 90% lurks and learns. So what we're actually doing is we're saying, okay, we can see exactly who the people are who create content. They're really important. We got to make sure we have the right relationships with them, that we give them the right content. The 9%, they are empowered more than ever through technology. So a couple of years ago, quite frankly, the influencers had all the power. Now, in 2015, the folks who share content have tremendous and growing power. So as a brand, we need to know the top 1,000, the top 10,000, the top 100,000 people who are going to move content related to a topic if we give it to them. And then they'll impact the rest of the gang. So that is a very different approach than let's go out to all the outlets, let's get as much attention as we can, let's count GRPs, let's kind of pray, if you will, that things will happen. Now we can see for sure what's really going on.
That 1990 model isn't antiquated. I mean, I'm sort of shocked by it because I would assume because of what we've had happen in the past, let's call it 5 years, everybody seems to be creating some form of content. Or are we talking strictly about the 1990 in relation to a brand?
Yeah, well, think it actually applies to all brands, B2B and B2C. And if you think about, like, say from like 2006 to, I would even say 2014, that 1% really did have a lot of power, I mean, so whether they were journalists or bloggers or other influencers, when they created content, people really moved, and they still have power. But what's really happened now is it's just so easy to move content that the 9%, which we see it go as high as 15% in some brands, but rarely much higher than that. They're making a big impact in penetrating the ecosystem. The other thing is, because we're all more socially active, we're following more of the right people. So when you think about it, if let's say you're doing something and you're followed by the right people, the effect of that is huge, and that is absolutely impacting search. So then the other 90% are finding the stories more effectively than ever before. So it's becoming a more relevant model as opposed to a more antiquated model, which is actually kind of interesting, all technology driven.
So my sort of thinking an iteration on that is that, okay, and it's a much more crowded world, and the half-life of this stuff is almost by the minute. It's not like you sort of have this blog post like the good old days, Bob,
Yep.
when you and I started, when you'd
Yep.
have this blog post and it could go for weeks or months and build momentum, have this virality to it, or any form of sort of social connectedness of it. Now, I mean, it's minute by minute, and there's so many more people creating and or curating it that you don't sort of see those bumps that we used to see. So does that make it more interesting
Hmm.
or more
Yeah.
dangerous?
Yeah, Mitch, you're totally right. Because if you go back, when I was at Dell and we were creating the first social media function for a Fortune 500 company, this is in the 2006 2009 timeframe, and you would, an individual blogger would have tremendous power, and so you'd have to go out and make sure that you treated them just like the New York Times or the FT.
And they stayed on it, right? Like if there was a dog on a bone, it could go for weeks and months too, which is another
Absolutely.
component of it.
Absolutely, and then everyone would be commenting back on that blog post, and then it would just center there. Now what we're seeing is it's actually the reverse. And so you have to say, okay, who is my audience? Do I actually know where they are, and what are they actually telling me? And so when you do that, you get into what time of day should you be putting content online. I mean, that's a very simple thing. Brands misalign on that all the time. So the peak time might be 7:30 on a Wednesday or Saturday at 3 o'clock. So if you're putting content out at 9 in the morning, you're going to totally miss your audience. So there's things like that. Or what kind of content does your audience actually want to talk about? You can actually see that now, where before you really couldn't. And so now you can align on content. What language do they use? There's not more than 15 words or phrases that drive the majority of people from your brand to what they're searching for. So what do you know on that? What channels are they hanging out in? So the ability to have precision in aligning with their audience is huge, and that's why we call it audience architecture. But when we were first starting out, we were just pleased that we had blog posts or that people cared about us. Now it's getting into the scientific part of it, and that's the big change.
Now, we're sort of time jumping here a little bit, but Bob, you were one of, if not the person responsible at Dell for building this social media infrastructure that really did become somewhat of a lighthouse for other corporations to think about what digital means to communications, marketing, PR. So, just in passing, you sort of said when I was at Dell, but there was this sort of big story there that you were paving the way. We find ourselves now, many years later, where it almost feels like that's almost 101. You have to have that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, when we, to be totally candid, when we first started out, I mean, Michael really said is like, we got to figure out how to reach our customers online more effectively. So we weren't even thinking of the name social media. And we just said, okay, how do we do this effectively? And this is the days when Radiant 6 was just being created and, companies like that. So in doing that, I think what we learned a lot of principles that still apply today. I think today we're getting into a phase where, you're right, it's table stakes to have a social media presence. But it's a huge mistake of companies who just say, oh, well, therefore I'll just have all my channels in place. I'll take my story and I'm just going to pound it out there and people will like it. And what we see more than ever now is that they've really never liked it. They like to actually have a conversation. They like to have companies that know who they are, things like that. I mean,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's crazy to me too, because I just was having lunch with a friend who, back in the early days of podcasting and blogging, now we're going back, close to 15 years. We were talking about how it's amazing how quickly things changed. It's amazing how quick it feels, but it was over 10 years. Digital has this strange way of making things look like they happened extremely fast, and yet it really has been a long time.
Yes. Yeah, and yet some of the things we were learning way back are we're still exploring. So when I think of 2007, we were one of the first companies to go big on Twitter. And so we ended up with 165 channels at the time on Twitter, and we started selling directly, from an e-commerce standpoint there. Well, here we are in 2015 going into 16. We're still struggling with how you sell through social media and e-commerce and put them together. And yet, I personally believe that that is a major opportunity for brands in the future to be able to sell directly through Pinterest or Snapchat or other channels that have the ability to show you what you want in a place where you can just basically touch and pay and just be on to the next thing.
It's funny. Now that I'm thinking about it, I actually want to correct what I said. It's not table stakes. You guys were doing things back in 2007 that was trailblazing that you would think was table stakes, but so many brands today are not even at that level of involvement that you were, which is even more frightening considering where the space is at.
Right. Yeah. One of my favorite sites that we built was IdeaStorm because
Yeah, sure.
Mark Benioff had created Idea Exchange with Salesforce.com, and I remember Michael said, hey, we got to do this for ourselves. Would you, think it through? And so Manish Mehta and myself and a few other folks worked together, and we put together IdeaStorm. And it was really cool because all of a sudden you're getting all these ideas coming in from your customers. They can vote on the ideas. They can talk about them. Our engineers and designers can see them, and it really did influence the choices that people would make in product design. So then you think, at the time I thought, oh, well, this is a no-brainer. Every company is going to do this. Here we are again, going into 2016. Very few companies allow themselves to get ideas directly from their customers in an unfiltered way so they can learn from them.
But there was a lot of disappointment around, not the Dell version of it, but this idea of crowdfunding ideas. And I think about Starbucks as well, which was lauded as being extremely successful, or even, the recent collapsing of Quirky, which had a very similar model as well. This idea that, yeah, you can get some form of iteration or better improvements, but the problems that there were many problems. One of them being when you don't do anything, the customers are like, well, now I told you what we wanted and you didn't do anything. Some of these ideas don't work. There's a whole bunch of things that happen that I think actually changed part of the social contract between consumers and brands almost. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there's corporations can be almost like that valedictorian A student type, like they don't want to do anything unless they can absolutely do everything they were told in a perfect way. And the reality is it's an imperfect world we're in. So if you're going to get ideas from your customers in an open way, you have to also be open to say, look, we're not going to use all these. We're going to get the input on these. We'll act on the ones that make sense. We'll give you feedback on the ones that don't. And in some of the cases, we're not going to do anything. And that's okay, as long as you handle it, I think, in the right way. But that's a tough thing for companies to kind of get their head around. What I think, though, is, even if you don't do an idea community, with the ability to look at audiences today and the ability to learn from them, I think that will change how we do market research, for example. So when I look at market research, we've done so much work in the past that is really on short-term memory. And so when you are doing like focus groups or you're asking people questions by a poll, people can only remember about 3 to 7 things on average about a topic. But if you actually watch that exact audience in aggregate, you can see their subconscious behavior and see what they really believe. And in the future, as you start to put both together, that's even more powerful. So I think like market research is actually going to not get weaker. I think it's going to get stronger as people realize they can combine the power of the web with the primary tools they've been doing for decades.
And that's an area that I know you're interested in and I'm interested in too. You talk in your work about this idea of how we're going to move from market research to customer insights, which I think is true and has happened. Where I think that next iteration is going to come, and it's been buzzwordy for a bit, but this idea of the voice of the customer. So you have people who are maybe not speaking to you or your brand directly, but they're actually talking about it, or they're looking for solutions to a problem that your products or services actually solves. And that sort of unstructured, we'll call it unstructured data, even though it's actually real people talking about real things, can be extremely valuable. And the big if here is if brands put the time, money, and investment in that, because it's not, like you said, it's not an immediate, like a focus group. You have to analyze it over time to get that richer understanding. Do you see businesses sort of smart enough to be like, we're on top of this? Or is that still like, yeah, well, let's hope in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I do see that trend happening with our clients. I have to probably be careful in the examples I use, but I'll just give you an example from like in the technology space in a general way. It's really important to know if you want to know what consumers matter for a product, you have to actually have the right audience that you're looking at. So the ability to profile and then understand who you're looking at, you cut out all the noise. But at the same time, you may be looking at resellers. And at the same time, you may be looking at B2B enterprise security professionals. And at the same time, you may be looking at your OEM supply chain. And so what you're actually then able to do is see how do different audiences look at the same exact product, and what is that telling me? So not only do you have a strategy for each audience, but you're getting smarter overall. But the key thing I find is that if you have to be very precise in the audience you're looking at, otherwise you just get a lot of false positives.
Where does creativity fit into this for you?
I believe that the way technology is changing, it's actually going to change the whole world of campaigning. So, the way certainly that you and I have grown up is you did a campaign that might take 6 to 9 months to do. It has to go through a full approval process. You do a big unveil, and then you put all your money behind it and you go. What we're seeing now is that if you actually can see what your audience is doing and you're tracking them properly, you move into a world of agile campaigning. And so, which leads to agile creative. So you can actually put content in within minutes to hours of seeing a movement in the market and actually shape the market. We do that now. It works really well. So it means you have to create a lot of content in advance. So you're ready to put it in, and then you also have to be able to, quite frankly, do creative on the fly. And that, I think, is changing how creative teams add even more value.
That brings me back to a point we talked a little bit about earlier. How sustainable is this for both the agency and brand model? It sounds tough because, that campaign that you built and put on TV, it wasn't like it was just there for like that 1.5 hour that everybody happened to be looking at you on Facebook. Mm-hmm. The content that you're talking about is so fleeting.
Yeah, but I think it's you're right. It's a matter of how you prepare. So let's say if I was going to do a campaign for a brand right now, I would say let's prepare a library of content that's indexed by target audience. And so then when we see things going on in the market, we can just put content in. And if it starts to work, we can actually put in more. If it doesn't work, we haven't overcommitted. So it doesn't mean you don't do a campaign. You still do campaigns, or we still will do campaigns to wake up a market to serve as a catalyst. But for 365 days of the year, we could be doing agile creative and agile campaigns. The other thing that we're seeing as a big change is towards what we call responsive experience. And so responsive experience is really how do we get the story to the person who wants it in the channel they want it, as opposed to making them come to us. And so this technology that we work on and others, where you can provide 4 to 6 pieces of content about a story and put it right in Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or on a website or internet. And what happens is people, of course, like that because they don't really want to click one thing and then click another and then click another. They would prefer to get to one place, see the whole story. And then, of course, you can see what they're touching, you can see what they're sharing, and you can even change that kind of content dynamically. So the ability for us to align with the audience in terms of how to do that is changing significantly as well. And I think it's a huge plus for the industry. I think any agency, if they evolve with the times, is going to benefit greatly.
I'm thinking about, I'm trying to sort of like frame this in so how has the model changed? So to get depth, if you were a traditional brand, you did depth primarily through what I would call repetition. You'd put the same ad in front of the person's face because that's all you had, like 30 seconds or a moment in the car or while they're flipping pages in a newspaper or magazine. And the real depth of getting that message to resonate, I believe, happened through repetition. It feels like depth in what you're talking about comes by repetition, but not even that same message replicated, but a sort of iteration of each message in that channel at the same time. Versus, or an additional thought is, because it's so messy for the consumer, right? All these platforms, all these channels, all these things, and all they're doing is sort of like thumb flicking at this point through everything. Where does that depth come from? Because it seems it feels like we're almost like 2 inches, thick and a mile long versus any sort of depth here.
Yeah, so you raise a number of really important points. I mean, one is the way we've always been trained over the years is we would just hit frequency. Let's hit people on these shows 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and then they will do something. The problem we have is, what I always like to say now is if no one's there listening, then you can't reach anyone. It's kind of like being on the side of a river, and if a boat's coming down the river, and I talk to the captain, we can connect. But if I'm in 3 hours too late, there's no one there to talk to. So we actually have to say, where are our customers, and are we actually relevant in their conversation? So what we can actually see is that if we do achieve relevance, the good news is customers are more than willing to act like a second Salesforce and to take our content and share it with their friends and talk about it and add commentary to it, which is actually more powerful than the repetition of us going back to that same person over and over. So we actually are starting to look more at, are we getting people to participate in some way in co-creating the story or co-sharing the campaign? So that's one example of it. The other thing is we're just in an age, whether we like it or not, where attention is an issue. Facebook has about 8 billion video views per day right now. And the average time for people to spend to decide if they want to listen to a video or not is about 3 seconds. So that's enough data for me to be comfortable to know that we've got an issue here of if we don't catch people right away, we've lost them.
I mean, it's funny you say that, and in my brain I'm like, yeah, and how many views are we seeing on YouTube? And we're seeing, I think, something close to 6 or over 6 billion just on Snapchat at this point as well. Mm-hmm. So it's not even that you have the one channel, you're competing against other channels that are in the billions as well.
Yes, exactly. So when you do get people's attention, it's actually probably more powerful than in the past because there's so much stuff that just goes right by people. So I always look at it as when you're getting a customer to participate in your activities, it's usually because the customer can share an idea, they can solve a problem, or they can share knowledge. And then the other part would just be they're having fun and they're entertaining themselves. But there's pretty primal desires that we have. And so if companies are focused on how do I provide a customer with something that's relevant that they can then share, we're in a great place. If we're saying, here's all this great stuff about us, we hope you like it, to be honest, most of that stuff just goes right down the river and there's no one there to listen to it.
Why do you think we focus on this conversation over a conversation that might be more like, what are we doing to build more one-to-one? What are we doing to build more personalization? What are we doing to build more optimization as we sort of whittle down to who the actual core customer is? Because we actually do know who they are in this amazing day and age. I still find it really interesting that we talk about those 3 pillars and they're interesting. I know you and I are excited about them, but I feel like, again, we still always go back to this, how do we message the masses?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think it's paying the bills today versus innovating for tomorrow, right? Mm-hmm. And so, we know that if we put enough muscle against anything, we're going to be okay. I mean, I always use the example to say, if I went into a boardroom today and said, I have this great new model, only 99.5% of people will hate what we give them every time. They're going to get frustrated with the frequency at which we hit them, but 0.5% will love it, and we'll get conversion, and we'll hit our sales numbers. If I said that, they would throw me out of the room. But that's actually email.
No, or e-commerce.
Or e-commerce, right? Exactly. So the models we have are not really that good. And so there's a maintenance level that has to be done because you do have to pay the bills, but we have to get smarter at what's happening. And one of my favorite charts that we look at is really it's like a 2013 to a 2015 chart, and it's what I was getting at before. Is it just shows how powerful the 1 and the 9 are connected together. And so if you can get in there and get people to start talking or sharing about something, the ability to penetrate the full audience is stronger than it ever was. In the way we're seeing the trends, that's only going to continue. So we have to get really good at catalyzing, when you say the one-to-one, catalyzing the ones that will hit the many, and as opposed to just going to the masses.
Suppose, Del, you went to Novartis prior to, you had some gigs also in between that, but prior to where you're at now. In 2011, you wrote a great book called PreCommerce, which actually speaks about that 1% that we ironically just
Yeah.
talked about, the fact that digital isn't just about that 1% that converts. It's what do you do with that 99% to get them closer so that you increase that 1% beyond that. I'm wondering, so you do the work, and again, it's a very sort of similar trajectory that I've had in terms of the output I put into the market to push things forward. I think we've both been in the same headspace, but what we want brands to do to better connect to customers. And yet, when I get asked about my sentiments about what brand loyalty means in 2015, I'm really candid about the fact that I don't know how loyal people are anymore because of this so much of stuff that we have. How do you feel about brand loyalty? Is brand loyalty just like a points accumulation, transactional gamification thing, or is it a real thing?
So it's interesting. I've never felt comfortable about brand loyalty even before we had technology like this. I think that we've always had models and metrics that would measure it, that would make us feel comfortable within an organization and say, look at our net promoter score, or look at the loyalty score we just created. But the reality is we never really knew for sure. I think now we can see reality, and there's different measures emerging. So, when you think about loyalty, loyalty is not necessarily how many times someone's coming back to your website, but it may be how big your share of conversation is in an audience that you care about, and how relevant are you in that conversation, and how often is that leading to people taking action. And so there's really a new generation of metrics that are occurring. When you look even at like social channels, give you an example like with Twitter. People often measure Twitter alone and say whether they did good or not, and celebrities are often used in Twitter. What we found by doing this over 1,000 times is that celebrities almost always have very little impact on the rest of the social channels out there. So what is done in Twitter tends to be a big, giant waste of money. And why is that? It's because they're doing a one-off event. They're not actually talking every day. They're not giving a cadence of conversation that people can count on. And that is actually how loyalty is often built with brands, is that they can count on you to be part of their life continually, not because you have a campaign or because you have a need to reach them. So that's that's a fairly obvious thing, right? It's just like us in real life. We tend to be friends with people that we can talk to on a regular basis and have a relationship with, not someone who shows up once a year and badgers us outside of our door.
So you're studying this thing, social media, and how it impacts customer decisions and how it can be used in that 1990 world. What happens next year? What happens next year when messaging becomes the thing and everything goes somewhat private? When you are doing things like you're purchasing through Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever it might be, and if you have a gripe with a brand, it's not sort of on that public platform of a blog or Twitter, but it's happening in private messaging that actually doesn't impact things like search results or brand sentiment if you do any form of analysis. To me, it's like this is like a dramatic thing, and I really do believe that messaging is going to be way bigger than social as it continues to erupt the way it has been.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things in there, Mitch. I mean, one of them is a shift towards omni-channel analytics. So what does that mean? Another buzzword is, if you're telling your story and you're first putting it out on Twitter, where's it going next? So what are the next 2 or 3 channels that conversation is going to? Is it going from Twitter to Instagram? Is it going from Instagram into Facebook? Is it going, where is it going? And is your story actually continuing in a way that makes sense? That's something that we need to get much better at understanding. If we look at search, we've been obsessed over the last probably 15 years on, hey, do we have reasonably good positives on a page when people do queries, as opposed to saying, what are all the ways that people would actually search for my story? And is my story actually showing up, as opposed to, do I have a positive first impression? And so we said, in most cases, by the way, with brands, you find the answer is no. That it might be a positive first screen, but it's really not the content that you want people to get in order to make the decision. And then the other thing is, at what point in you telling a story are people ready to buy? And so, I think of Snapchat and think, really, Snapchat should be selling us stuff directly as soon as possible, because we're on a timeline. We're actually seeing what's going on. We're able to focus on things we care about. We can put our credit card or any payment provider against Snapchat, and we could just buy right there.
But is this what people, I mean, we know it is what people want to a certain degree, but I wonder about how this evolution happens. I think we make assumptions like, we could put through, I mean, I think the sort of untethering of the buy button is happening everywhere, whether it's Google, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat. But people aren't necessarily there for that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I think I always look at like how do we form new habits, and those habits are very powerful. So we are used to going into iTunes. We are used to going to Google. We're used to going to Facebook. We spend enormous amounts of time in these locations every day. When we're that familiar with a site, it's not a big stretch to say, maybe I'll buy something in there as well. I mean, we already do that with Apple all the time. There's really no reason why we wouldn't buy directly from Google for whatever we want. There's no reason why we wouldn't buy from Facebook on whatever we want. So I think it actually helps e-commerce because companies will have to really become more relevant in how they integrate with social channels to sell direct. And I think credit card companies will just, there'll be that back end that will make it all happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest flaws I always joke about is I think Google's biggest misstep was, although it turned into a multi-billion-dollar company with AdWords, would have been just become an affiliate. Right? If you just buy because of the search result, I think it could have been a whole lot bigger than AdWords.
Exactly.
So I want to, before we wrap up, I want to hear a little bit about the work you're currently doing. It crossed my radar that as we are in 2016, as this year unfolds, you've got another book coming out, Storytizing?
Yes.
Tell me a bit about where you're going with that.
Yeah, so it's PreCommerce. The first book was, as you mentioned before, basically about if less than 1% of people actually spend time in their life buying something online, 99% of their time is pre-commerce. And so that was the journey there. When we get into storytizing, it's storytizing what's next after advertising. And what I'm looking at there is if you understand exactly who your audience is, which we were talking about earlier, the next thing is how do you storytize your story? So in other words, how do you get the content to the right people so they actually pull through the right channels so you actually truly reach the full audience that you care about? So the days of raising awareness or getting lots of impressions or whatever point system you choose are far less relevant than can you actually reach the right people and pull it through and do it in coordination with your audience. So it's I would say like a more sophisticated view of what we learned in pre-commerce now applied to what we're doing with clients on a regular basis.
So one of the biggest challenges you face, I face, let's call it we as an agency, we all face, is click fraud and ad blocking. I mean, these are, again, this is stuff that I think is really serious. It's really important. The click fraud to me is interesting because I think that there's a discrepancy between the nefarious souls who are clicking on competitors to sort of have them be broken down. I think that's a small fraction next to the fact that we have a lot of intermediaries between an ad that's created in a place like your agency or my agency, and then along the delivery channel of it actually getting viewed. There's just a lot of technical factors in there that I don't think the media world appreciates. It's almost like MacGyver, right? It's chicken wire and duct tape here. It's not as obvious as we saw it on TV, and there it goes. On the ad blocking side, of course, more and more people are saying, these are bad experiences. I want to, have these experiences go away. There was a New York Times report that really was staggering that said, when people have ad blocking software on their devices, in particular on their mobile devices, not only are they blocking ads, but the experience is a lot smoother and faster because there's no load times and third-party ads being served and stuff like that. I see this, and I think the biggest concern, which is tied directly into the work you're trying to do on this next book, is that it's going to float up into the content world, where suddenly now we're going to start questioning things like, when is this content viewed? Do people block certain content because they don't like it? It's not what they were looking for. I think all the problems we're facing on what we think is the sort of annoying world of banner ads is going to roll right into this world that you and I are talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things in there. One of them is you are right. I think friends of mine in industry believe it could be as high as 40% of their digital spend it could be either click fraud or just, quite frankly, bad use of funds. And so how do you change that? Well, there's I think a shift that's occurring where we just spend a lot more time and money against earned and shared media. We are seeing the birth of what we call strategic paid. So if you think about it today, we all know we can do far lower spends in social channels and move content. And what we're going to be moving towards in the future is that we'll say, okay, if something's moving in Facebook, we know that we can generally do 10 spends over 3 days, which will cost us $5,000 for this particular piece of content. The trick is how to then scale that out. But the ability to see what is real is improving. The problem is we tend to buy media in mass, and that's the ultimate issue of how things will have to change. We just can't do that and expect things to change.
But we're sort of doing that a little bit, Bob, right? Like people are now making content, and because of the way the Google and Facebook algorithms work, they're buying ads against driving people to the content. Like it's the craziest thing versus
Exactly.
like, let me just buy an ad and hope you transact.
Exactly. So, that's what we're saying is that we think that will change where ESO or earned, shared, and owned media will drive paid media as opposed to the reverse. So the easiest way to look at that is, if like, let's say you and I did a piece of content today and put it on Facebook and we're like, wow, that's really connected. Well, okay, let's move it now to the audience we care about with a $500 buy. Hey, you know what? It resonated more. Let's do a $1,000 buy. Really resonated. You know what? Let's do a $10,000 buy. But you then, the problem with that is right now is you need human beings to be watching things, judging, and figure it out. In the future, I think it will get easier and easier to do that, but it takes away that fraudulent behavior. A lot of the fraud that occurs is we don't even know where these ads are that are being clicked on, and we're not even sure when we really look at it why were they even put there in the first place. So that is something I think we can stop with time. The other thing is that the banner ad part of our world, it was never that effective. It's getting less effective every day. At some point, you just have to kind of put your hand up and say, this stuff doesn't really work that well. Why are we doing this?
Yeah, I mean, that statement's really, it bothers me because I think that ads in the right space with the right creative really do work well. I think the problem isn't in the actual technology or the format. I think it's in, again, our sort of laziness as marketers to not spend the time working, targeting, and building real creative around the message that works. I see it time and time again. I was just looking at this piece of tech from my MacBook on whatever page it was, and sure enough, the next thing I know, it's right there on my Facebook. It's been retargeted. I haven't even done anything. It's just literally off of the browser being open, and I just look at that and I go, well, this is why people hate it. And there, the easier bridge would have been like, he looked at this page. Is there a message versus just creeping him out that it's suddenly there? And so again,
let me give you an example of where I think this goes, because I hear you, and I have tremendous respect for telling a story well and all the creativity that goes into it. But imagine this, today a banner ad is you see something, you click on it, we all know that drill. But in the future, you would see something, and as you touch it, a capsule would come up, and you would actually see a video that would tell you something about it. You would see a slide deck over to the left. You see FAQs over here. You would see a bucket where you can go buy. You would see 3 or 4 other pieces of content. The entire story of what you needed would have already been curated for you.
Wow.
And so now, depending on what you touch, the other content will change. So it becomes an immersive experience, and you haven't even left that page.
I've seen formats like that. I just think, again, they sort of stuff it with junk.
Right. Well, but that's the difference between, I think, great creative and promotion. So if we're really sticking to great creative, we're saying, how do we tell a story that's compelling, that's going to move people to action versus, oh my gosh, I got to sell stuff today. Let's jam it in with junk that's 30% off and people will do something. They're 2 totally different approaches.
Yeah, but of course, that's the pre-commerce stuff. It's the transaction versus the interest versus where are they in whatever journey they may be in.
Exactly. But I think that in the limited amounts of times where we're testing that kind of stuff now, the conversion rates are totally different.
Yeah.
So I think that with time, people will see that the metrics are so compelling when you actually focus on sharing a story versus just a one-off ad or a one-off, piece of content.
Bob, I really enjoy the time you've taken, so thank you so much for that. Hopefully you'll be willing to come back in March to talk about storytizing when it's good to go. Let people know where they can best connect with you in the digital sphere.
Yeah, that would be great. And it was a pleasure to be on here, Mitch. I think what you're doing is great, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm at Bob Pearson 1845 on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to follow me. And w2ogroup.com is our website.
Thanks again so much for your time, Bob.
Thank you, Mitch.